A man living a double life. His family and community had no idea. All they saw was a hardworking man who was an amazing father and good boyfriend. But little did they know that in reality, he was an arsonist, bank robber, and murderer. Hello, welcome to my channel. My name is Jessica, and today we'll be covering the true crime case of Israel Keyes. On Tuesdays, I do true crime videos, and on Saturdays, I do videos on a deeper look into crime. Those are basically just on topics that revolve either around crime or death. This video is for educational purposes. I'm not an expert. I have just researched this topic and pulled information together to make this video. I would like to add a trigger warning. We will be talking about SA, a white supremacy church, and someone unaliving themselves. If that is too much for you, I completely understand. But without further ado, let's get into the video. Israel Keyes was born in Cove, Utah on January 7th, 1978. He was the second born out of 10 siblings, and his mother and father, Heidi and John, belonged to the LDS Mormon Church. They didn't believe in government assistance, public schools, or modern medicine. And while living in Utah, they actually stayed in tents for some time while their father was building a small cabin on their property. Once it was done, since they were Mormons, they didn't have any electricity or running water. And when Israel was 3 or 4, they moved to Colville, Washington. Colville is an extremely small town, even still today. As of the 2020 census, there's less than 5,000 people living there. So could you imagine how small the population was in the 80s? After their move, they decided to leave the LDS Church and decided to join a fundamentalist white supremacy church called the Ark. And it's believed that they did this because of their neighbor, Chivy Kehoe, who was a member there. He is a whole nother story. He was arrested for hate crimes and murder and is now serving 3 consecutive life sentences. Anyway, back to Israel. In the 1990s, they relocated yet again to Maupin, Oregon, which is still a small town. But now we're in Israel's teenage years. As a teenager, he loved to hunt and torture animals. At this time too, he would often break into neighbors' houses, usually by himself, but sometimes with friends, to steal guns and other valuables that they had. Unfortunately for the kids, the family picked up and moved again, but this time it was across the United States. They decided to move to a very small Amish community of about 415 people in Smyrna, Maine. But this was it for the family. They wanted to stay there. They finally found the area that they felt comfortable at. They started setting up roots and started a maple syrup business. At this time, Israel was in his late teens, and he decided at 18 that it was time to tell his family that he no longer wanted to be a part of the Amish community. Instead, he told them that he was an atheist, and his parents were pissed. Well, at least his dad was. His dad kicked him out of the house and shunned him and never spoke to him again, but he did remain in communications with his mom. In 1998, at the age of 20, Israel decided to join the Army as a specialist. And while being in the Army, he was stationed in Texas, Washington State, and even Egypt, which is pretty cool. His friends in the Army often said that he would keep to himself and was pretty quiet, but they also said that on the weekends, he would consume whole bottles of alcohol, so he probably wasn't too contained then. While in the Army, he also had his first run-in with police. He was driving while intoxicated and got charged with a DUI and also for driving with an invalid license. A couple months after being charged for that, he was honorably discharged in 2001, and he received a lot of medals and awards. I'll read them out to you. He received the Army Achievement Medal, Army Service Ribbon, Marksman Badge with Rifle Bar, Expert Infantryman Badge, and the Assault Air Badge. After being discharged, he moved to the Macaw Reservation with the mother of his daughter, and they were together for about 6 years. But when things didn't work out, he met another woman who was a nurse practitioner, and together with his daughter, they moved to Anchorage, Alaska. Okay, so now it's 2007, and Israel, his girlfriend, and daughter just moved to Alaska. Well, Israel decided that this was his chance to start the next chapter in his life. He decided to start his very own business called Keyes Construction. And here he did handyman work, and he was also a construction contractor. So, of course, his main operations were in Alaska, but he did travel all around the United States for his business, and unfortunately, that's how he got to his victims. This traveling gave Israel a large geographical range, and on top of that, he didn't really have a specific victim type. Instead, he would just find people that were alone in isolated areas like parks, parking lots, and campgrounds. On top of that, every time he traveled, he also would pack a murder kit. These kill or murder kits would often have the same kind of things in them, and they would help him with his crimes. It usually included a pew-pew, ammunition, zip ties, plastic bags, a bottle of Drano, sometimes a small shovel, and money. As of right now, these kill kits have only been found in Alaska and New York. However, Israel claims that there are some in Washington, Wyoming, Texas, and Arizona. When Israel traveled, he would just use cash and rent cars. That way, if he did find a victim, he was less likely to get caught. But if he was actively looking for a victim, he would also pull the battery out of his cell phone. That way, he couldn't be traced back to that location. 2 years after moving to Alaska, Israel robbed a small community bank branch in Tupper Lake, New York. He was threatening people with his pew-pew, waved it around, scared everybody, got his money, and luckily, no one was hurt. Later on, though, he did claim that he robbed a lot more banks, but they never found true evidence of that. He also admitted to a burglary that he did in Texas that same year. He said that he broke in to steal some valuables, he got some jewelry and some other things, and then set the house on fire. Later, he said he did this because it was in a small town, so he figured that if the fire department and police were all busy heading over there, that would open the way for him to do his next crime. So he lined the house with clothing and all the bedding he could find, and poured Drano or gasoline as the accelerant and set it on fire. Then he drove back into town where he could see the house with binoculars, and when all the police were showing up, he decided it was time to rob that bank. And later that day, he successfully robbed yet another bank. This one was in Azle, Texas. He was wearing a hard hat, surgical mask, and sunglasses. He waved his pew-pew round again, scared everybody, got his money, and ran out. At the time, he rented a Kia Soul, so he drove that over to a gas station that was nearby and waited there and filled up his car while all the police were showing up so he could just see his crimes in action. What a cocky son of a bitch. The next documentation of his crime was 2 years later in June of 2011. He flew over to Chicago, rented a car, and drove over to Essex Junction, Vermont. On June 8th, Israel broke into the Currier's home. People who knew Bill and Lorraine said that they were friendly and happy people who loved to spend time together at home with their dogs. Bill was an animal care technician at the University of Vermont, and Lorraine worked in the finance department at Fletcher Allen Healthcare. That night, Israel drove around, scoped out the area, and got his murder kit. In this one was zip ties, a pew-pew, a silencer, Drano, and duct tape. After he got it, he went back to his hotel until around midnight. He probably paid for it with cash and a fake name. And then at midnight, he made his way over to Bill and Lorraine Currier's home. He walked over there and broke in through the attached garage. He made his way upstairs where Bill and Lorraine were sleeping, and they woke up with him standing over them wearing a headlamp and armed with a pew-pew. He then zip-tied them up and asked where their wallets and if they had a safe or a pew-pew. Of course, they told him, and Israel took their pew-pew, wallets, and cell phones. Then he forced Bill and Lorraine downstairs and put them in their own car and drove off. Israel took them to a farmhouse that he scoped out earlier that day. Once he parked, he took Bill out of the car and brought him into the farmhouse downstairs to the basement. He zip-tied Bill to a stool, and when he was sure that he was secure, he went back to the car for Lorraine. When Israel made his way back to the car, he opened the door and Lorraine sprung out. She started sprinting to the main road. She was so close, but she wasn't fast enough. Israel tackled her down to the ground and then dragged her into the farmhouse. This time, though, he brought her into a bedroom and tied her to a bed. When Bill heard all the rumbling from them walking, he started yelling for his wife because he was so worried. and this just pissed Israel off. Once he realized that Lorraine was tied to the bed securely, he made his way downstairs to confront Bill. When Israel got downstairs, he realized that Bill partially freed himself, and this really pissed off Israel. He took a shovel and began beating Bill in the head with it repeatedly. This wasn't enough, though, and he turned around and shot Bill multiple times. Still being in a fit of rage, he worked his way back to the room where Lorraine was. He cut her clothing off with a knife and SA'd her twice. The second time he SA'd her, he strangled her until she was unconscious and then dragged her body to the basement so that way when she woke up, she could see her husband's body. When Lorraine woke up and saw her husband's body, she began crying uncontrollably, of course. But Israel took this as his advantage, and he then went behind Lorraine and strangled her until she died. Once Lorraine was dead, Israel went to the car and got his murder kit. He dragged their bodies into a corner of the basement and poured Drano on them, probably to speed up the disintegration process, and covered them with debris. He then went back to Bill and Lorraine's car and drove it to where his was parked at the hotel, and then drove his car off. The next day, Bill's sister Diana got a phone call from his veterinary office saying that Bill didn't come in and Lorraine and Bill both aren't answering their phone. That day, Diana too tried to call them, and when they didn't answer, she reported them missing. And this case was pretty well publicized. The whole community wanted them to come back. They were all rooting for Diana to find her brother and sister-in-law. Unfortunately, their bodies were never found. Not even a year later, Israel got his next victim. On February 1st, 2012, he abducted an 18-year-old barista named Samantha Koenig from work. She was a barista at the Common Grounds coffee shop in Anchorage, Alaska, which was a drive-up and walk-up little kiosk. Then he forced her into his rental car and drove off. He told her while driving that he just wanted to hold her for ransom, and as long as she cooperated, she'd be okay. He took her phone and texted her boyfriend and said, quote, "I'm spending a couple days with friends. Let me dad know." See, Samantha lived at her dad's with her boyfriend, and as soon as he saw that message, he knew there was no way it could have been her that wrote that. Samantha would never just leave without any kind of warning. Even though they knew this wasn't like Samantha, they gave her the night because maybe she really did just need to spend the night with her friends. Maybe something happened and they didn't know. So they did. And when she didn't show up the next morning, they reported her missing. Okay, so now Israel and Samantha are in the car. He just sent the message to her boyfriend and decided it was time to continue with his plan. He drove Samantha to his property and put her in his shed where his daughter and girlfriend weren't allowed in. He put on the radio really loud so that way no one could hear her in there, and zip-tied her hands together. Israel wanted her debit card, but she didn't have it on her because she left it at the coffee shop. So Israel left her in the shed and went back to go get it. He was able to retrieve her wallet, so it had her debit card, ID, and any money that she had in there, and he made his way back to his property. Once back home, he was ready to finish what he started. He poured himself a glass of wine and made his way back to the shed. There, he essayed Samantha and strangled her to death. He then took her body and shoved it into some kind of big, large storage box or chest. Then, Israel made his way inside and packed for a 2-week cruise. Yep. He was going to be gone for 2 weeks with Samantha's body in his shed. So, the next morning, he dropped his daughter off at school and made his way to the airport. 2 weeks later, when he got back from his cruise, he then decided it was time to start his ransom letter. So he made his way to the shed and pulled Samantha's body out of the chest. Okay, so I know most of us are thinking that bodies decompose after death. But because it was Alaska and it was February, it was so cold that her body was frozen solid. He needed to make her look alive, and he couldn't do that if her body was frozen. Once she was thawed, he applied makeup onto her face and braided her hair, which he later said was exactly how he braided his daughter's hair, which is disgusting. And then he sewed her eyelids open with fishing line. Yeah. Then he took a newspaper from 4 days previously and took a picture of it next to her head. He put the picture onto his ransom letter and said that he wanted $30,000. He then took the ransom letter to Connor Park and put it under a missing dog poster for a dog named Albert and texted Samantha's boyfriend. The text said, quote, "Connor Park, sign under pic of Albert, ain't she purty?" A few days later, he drove to Matanuska Lake to dispose and dismember her body. He cut a hole into the ice and dumped her remains into it. He also said later on that he took pieces, small ones, of her body and went fishing with it. Then he caught some fish and brought them home to his girlfriend and wife to eat for dinner. Yeah, this guy was sick. And this lake might as well have been an ocean. It was 700 feet deep. But while Israel was doing this, Samantha's father was able to pull the community together, and they got the $30,000. And they deposited it into Samantha's accounts like Israel requested. A few days later, Israel made his way down to Texas for a work trip. And since he was traveling now, he figured it was safe to start pulling out that money. So, along Arizona, New Mexico, Alaska, and Texas, he stopped at multiple banks to pull out $500 each time. As soon as Israel started using Samantha's cards, they noticed a trend that he was working his way down south. So they figured he was going to head to Texas, which he did. They still didn't know who he was because he did a good job at covering up his appearances every time he went to an ATM. However, they did get surveillance footage of the vehicle he was driving. So that's what Alaskan police gave to the Texas authorities. On March 16, 2012, a truck with that description was pulled over by a Texas state trooper for committing a minor offense of just 3 miles an hour over the posted speed limit. Turns out, it was Israel. They finally had him. Upon being pulled over, they searched his car and they found Samantha's ID, debit card, and cell phone. So he was arrested right then and there. Texas expedited him back to Alaska, where he confessed to 8 murders. However, the FBI believes that it was really 11 murders and 20 to 30 burglaries. In March of 2012, investigators were able to get 40 hours of interrogations with Israel Keyes. A lot of it, though, was just them trying to get some information out of him. Like, you could tell by watching it, he really didn't care about the victims, and he didn't care about giving the families closure. After hours and hours of interrogation, he finally agreed to tell police what happened. However, he had a stipulation. He wanted to ensure that the police and media would keep out his daughter's name and his girlfriend's name, because he didn't want his actions to affect their lives any more than it already has. After the police agreed, he told them everything. He told them where Samantha and Bill and Lorraine's bodies were. They went to go get Samantha's body in April of 2012, and they were able to bring it home to her family. However, the same can't be said for Bill and Lorraine's bodies. See, when investigators showed up, the house was demolished. It was a total wreck. But they weren't going to give up yet. They spent 2.5 months and hundreds of people and hours in search for their bodies, but they were still never able to be recovered. During these interviews, he also said that he really enjoyed killing people and he liked seeing the media coverage. So the reason that the FBI think that he committed 11 murders was because while in prison, he used blood and drew out 11 skulls. They believe each one symbolized each one of his victims. In the book American Predator by Maureen Callahan, she says that she believes that he got away with it for so long because he actually studied criminal profilers and other serial killers. His favorite one of them all was Ted Bundy. In this book, she also talks about different theories. One of them says that it's believed that he got a gastric band so that way he wouldn't go hungry as much when he was on the hunt. It's also said that they believe he got plastic surgery in Mexico to lessen the hair on his body and even change his fingerprints. She also mentions that he got away with it for so long because he didn't have a specific victim type. He had a large geographical range. He always made sure to disguise himself, use cash, and always rent cars so nothing could get tracked back to him. On top of that, he never had any connections with his victims, and he never hit the same place twice. On December 2nd, 2012, 9 months after being arrested, Israel took his own life by cutting his wrists and strangling himself with bed sheets. He didn't leave a straight-up unaliving note, but he did write a 4-page ode to murder. In this, he didn't really give any more details or information, but in it, he did call his victims, quote, pretty captive butterflies. 8 days after Israel's death, a funeral was held in Deer Park, Washington. There, his mom and 4 of his sisters attended. The pastor that spoke at Israel's funeral, Jake Gardiner, started off the funeral by saying, quote, he is not in a better place. He is in a place of eternal torment. The people of his community and his girlfriend never expected that Israel would be capable of doing something like this. They saw him as a nice, hardworking construction worker and a good father. It just goes to show that you can't trust a book by its cover. That case was a lot. And just think, if he wasn't doing that minor traffic infraction, or if that state trooper never found him, how many more people would he have murdered? Would he have even stayed in Texas or in the United States? He could have made his way over to Mexico. Like, who even knows? Well, that's it for me today. Thank you so much for watching this video, and if you liked it, please consider liking the video or maybe even subscribing. If you have any case suggestions, please leave them in the comments down below. That way I can make videos of cases that you're all interested in. I hope you all have a wonderful day. Bye. Why is it so hard to talk to a camera? Damn. Are you fucking kidding me?